One of the things I've always found interesting about Mortal Kombat is the sheer amount of fighters that can imitate other fighters.
You're imitating the God-Man.
You've got Shang, you've got Shinnok, you've got Quan stealing people's fatalities in MK4, you've got Triborg in the Cyber Initiative, and many more. The ones listed are fairly easy to explain. Any person who can steal souls, or at least snag a bit of soul energy, absorbs not just the victim's life force, but their skills, knowledge, and genetic traits as well. Because the soul isn't some translucent jellyfish spirit inside your body, it is your body, along with your consciousness. Makes sense, since once you've extracted someone's soul, there's barely anything left. When Shang Tsung steals a soul, he can access that person's abilities as if they were his own. When Shinnok steals a move, he's leeching off a bit of their life force and a bit of their power along with it. Quan Chi presumably does the same via his trance move, although MK4 really is the only instance where he copies anything from his opponents, so that might just be some kind of illusion magic meant to mimic and mock the victim. But his trance likely is a soul technique, which means some soul energy is being siphoned, technically speaking. And then Triborg, the Cyber Initiative's brainchild, does the technological equivalent of soul stealing by uploading the Lin Kuei's entire database of cyberized fighters into itself, thus accessing every single byte of information collected from these fighters, including but not limited to their memories, skills, fighting styles, weapon schematics, and genetic material necessary to replicate their powers. Now, that's all fine and dandy, but there are plenty of other characters that are neither soul stealers nor copybot 5000s, yet they can steal your powers faster than Batman can steal your wife. Needless to say, I have a theory, and it involves most of the reptilian species and variants from the Mortal Kombat mythos. Reptile, Onaga, the Chameleons, Shujinko, they're all part of a complex genetic puzzle with some intriguing implications, and this may be the biggest example of accidental brilliance in the series yet. So strap in, this will get science-y, fanficky really fast. Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 and Mortal Kombat Trilogy introduced the two chameleon characters, one male, one female. The lore on these two is almost as non-existent as a transgender's placenta, but we do know that the female chameleon is a Terran, the same race as Reptile, so presumably the more grammatically endowed chameleon has the same origin. Their gimmick is that they're deeply unoriginal people, so they just plagiarize other people's powers. The C-Meleon cycles randomly through all the other male ninjas' powers, while the K-Meleon does the same with the ladies. Presumably they'd be the most boring conversation partners because they just parrot back everything you say.
You dare mock me! You dare mock me!
The interesting thing about this is they didn't need to kill these other ninja and consume their souls to use their powers. They also didn't need to become cyborg Terminators and shove a USB stick with a copy of those powers up their asses. They aren't sorcerers, they don't use illusion, so what gives? There are two angles I'd like to explore, the soul angle and the evolutionary angle. Let's cover the soul one first. So far, I've covered two main ways of using this element, enhancing your own soul or manipulating the soul of another, with a potential third option in the form of Cetrion's plant life and mutated limbs. The second technique is by far the most infamous, with advanced practitioners able to completely steal and assimilate the souls of their victims, and this is the only known way to gain the abilities of another. Except the chameleons seem to imply that this is not necessary, which makes a certain kind of sense. In theory, you don't need to fully consume someone's soul to mimic them. That's a terribly inefficient way of doing it. Yes, you're stronger, but the excess energy eventually runs out and it could trigger soul addiction later on. Also, it kills people. A much more elegant solution would be to just analyze enough of the opponent's soul to mimic it with your own. Having a limited degree of control over your own soul energy is one thing. You're stronger, more resilient, you live longer, but soul mimicry is something else entirely, and requires a whole other level of mastery over one's own soul to pull off. Perhaps it seems a bit overpowered to make these saurian characters so good at soul manipulation, but given most of Reptile's depictions, the raw power of chameleons, Zatera's reputation, and a few evolutionary connections we're gonna discuss in a bit, I think it makes sense. So it would seem that the chameleons are advanced soul users, and that's the secret to their power. But there's another piece to the puzzle. Zatera is not actually Reptile's original homeworld. His people migrated there after Raiden and Shinnok's conflict millennia ago. Their original homeworld is Earthrealm. And as we know, the 6 main realms featured in the series used to be just one world, so technically all races come from the same place, much like how all humans likely have the same black ancestor, or how the 7 continents used to be one big landmass. All of this means that most of these seemingly disparate species share a common ancestor. The other notable reptilian species in the MK universe is dragons. Now, dragons are very poorly explained in the lore. I've touched on this before, but you have a lot of subset of dragons that seemingly have nothing to do with each other, and anthropomorphic dragons and half dragons that look nothing like dragons, and nowadays everyone's a dragon, so the whole thing is speeding down the autistic spectrum like a cow down a ski slope. But there's one dragon in particular who sports a very interesting set of abilities.
Onaga.
Most of Onaga's abilities are self-evident. He's a dragon, he can fly, he breathes fire, he has the power to resurrect the dead, and killing him apparently just pisses him off. But there is one ability that's very much understated and goes by unnoticed, and that ability is the same copycat power we've been discussing. It goes by unnoticed because Onaga himself doesn't use it. He bestows it. As Damashi, Onaga had the power to bestow chameleon-like abilities to Shujinko. Shujinko is just a human normo with no special abilities of his own. Yet after accepting Damashi's boon, he was able to copy other people's powers just by observing, sparring with, and learning from them without ever needing to extract their souls. Quan Chi and Shinnok both have some necromantic ability, but they likely pale compared to Onaga's, who had a much better understanding of soul energy such that he was able to resurrect entire armies with ease, not as skeletons or undead revenants, but fully restored them back to life. So it makes sense for an apex soul practitioner like him to unlock this kind of soul manipulation 2.0 ability, copying another's soul energy without having to steal it. Thus, he was likely able to tweak Shujinko's own soul in this manner as well, upgrading it with this ability. But then there's also the evolutionary angle to consider. Onaga's a reptilian, as are the Chameleons, who are part of the Saurian race. As hinted at before, it's likely that all of these different species of draconids and reptilians all share the same ancestry. This is an ability that was honed and perfected hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years ago, that culminated in the Dragon King, and that co-evolved or was passed down to Reptile's race. This is Zaterra's heritage, and the superior alternative to soul stealing, as you don't have to kill the person whose talents you're copying. There was this TV show about superpowered people called Heroes back in the day, kinda like X-Men meets CW drama, and this reminds me a lot about the lore behind the powers on that show. The hero and the villain both had the ability to copy other people's superpowers, but the hero did it just by being around them, while the villain had to kill said people to get them. So this is much like Peter Petrelli's empathic mimicry compared to Sylar's intuitive aptitude. Peter simply rewired his brain to mimic those of other superpowered people, while Sylar needed to kill other people and expose their brains in order to study them. Yeah, if you're anything like me and you like geeking out about lore and how superpowers work, which you obviously do since you're watching this channel, then give Heroes a shot. You might like it. Just make sure to stop after the 3rd season. You'll thank me later. Anyway, this explains why Damashi/Onaga had such a power to pass on to Shujinko. It also calls into question whether or not this power is magical or indeed purely evolutionary in nature, since Shujinko retained his abilities after Onaga revealed himself to him. It would have made sense for the Dragon King to strip Shujinko of his abilities after he had served his purpose, but he didn't. Perhaps he couldn't. Perhaps what this truly is a fundamental rewiring of the brain. Much like the mutant gene from the X-Men mythos, it's a matter of evolving the brain to the point where it can hack the body's evolutionary mechanism and supercharge it, in this case allowing one to learn any skill almost instantly just through observation, and forcing the body to adapt and grow whatever tissues and glands and hormones necessary to accommodate certain abilities. But then you're also talking about the 2 chameleons mimicking tools and weapons like spears, fans, and staves, so that goes way beyond genetic material and might just be some kind of illusion technique. As for why these different sets of abilities, or personas, keep cycling randomly, obviously I just leave that as a gameplay gimmick, cause it's a fun bit of RNG to add to a fighting game. But also terrible for tournament play, so perhaps the next incarnations of these chameleon characters could do away with the randomness and just give them Scorpion's Spear, Sub-Zero's Slide, Rain's Lightning Bolt and such, such as always available moves. But since I feel like you're gonna ask me to contrive a lore explanation for it anyway, it could be a literal personality thing like I alluded to earlier. Perhaps the mental trigger for these powers are tied to the personality of the original user that was copied, so to mimic them, you would need to become them in a sense, like an impressionist, or like a Doppler from the Witcher series, who would need to literally become someone and embody their personalities, thoughts, and beliefs in order to impersonate them. And that also affords some interesting story possibilities for these two characters. Another explanation could be memory. The Chameleons could have a literal memory limitation, which would explain why they only ever sport the abilities of a few people and only one at a time, perhaps maintained only by periodically being in close proximity to them. Evolving such powers on the fly requires a supercharging of all biological systems, and retaining superpowers and skills that normally take lifetimes to master would likely require some astronomical memory demands. It then stands to reason that you can forget these skills as fast as you get them. For a regular person, acquiring and forgetting skills is a much slower process. It takes years to acquire the skill and years to forget it and get completely out of practice. The same thing happens for chameleons, except way faster. The sheer information that the brain needs to commit to memory is so high that as soon as the skills are no longer being used, or the original skill donor is no longer being observed, the information is dumped to free up memory, so you end up with this kind of revolving door of characters that you can mimic one at a time. Then you can retreat to the shadows and stalk and observe and copy the targets some more to relearn stuff and reoccupy memory banks. This sounds a lot like a computer, but at the end of the day, we are nothing more or less than biological computers. We work in much the same way and malfunction in much the same ways. Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, psychosis, etc. If we're being honest with ourselves, dragons and reptilian motifs are the heart and soul of Mortal Kombat's aesthetic and even its storytelling to a degree. What with the elder gods usually being depicted as stylized Asian dragon creatures and the ultimate OG ruler of the big bad realm being a dragon, and the hero of the series swimming in dragon motifs and having fucking dragon-shaped dragon fire, so dragonids and reptilians are the supreme beings in the Mortal Kombat mythos. And it just so happens that soul is the supreme element in my power system, so it makes sense that the two would go together. And between that and the stuff connecting Shujinko, the chameleons, and the soul eaters, I think we can log all of this as another bit of accidental brilliance. Or an ass pull.